Today we're very fortunate to have FBI Supervisory Special Agent David Morgan join us today. Special Agent Morgan will be able to provide a very unique perspective on the important and ever-challenging and changing landscape related to data privacy and security. Also joining me on the panel today is my colleague Dominic Paluzzi. Dom is a key member of our data privacy and cybersecurity team and is recognized nationally as one of the few attorneys in the country that specializes in this area. Dom and I, although based out of our Detroit office, typically live out of small suitcases because we do quite a bit of traveling related to providing educational seminars and training in this area. You may have questions today. We're hoping you have questions. We've gotten some in advance. We'll be happy to answer as many questions as we can given our time limit. If we don't get to all of the questions, we'll be sticking around afterwards, and certainly we'll have time to talk to you about any questions that we have not been able to cover. For those of you here with us, you have cards that you can write your questions on. If you raise your hand, somebody will grab those questions and provide them to us. If you are tuning in through the webcast, you're welcome to email your questions by clicking on the email link on your screen. You're welcome to join the conversation on Twitter feed using hashtag MHBusinessHour. It's a lot of introductory information. To our program and to Special Agent Morgan. We've had an opportunity to handle hundreds of data breaches over the years, and one of the things that we always do when we are faced with any kind of privacy incident and we're conducting analysis with clients is we evaluate whether or not we should be including law enforcement. And historically, our clients have pushed back, I think for a variety of reasons, on not wanting to get law enforcement involved. I think part of it is they're concerned that the feds will be digging through books, will be looking into the business, and it makes them uncomfortable. However, lately we've noticed that the tide seems to be shifting a little and people's attitudes seem to be shifting, and there seems to be at least a little more openness to getting folks from your agency and other agencies involved. Are you starting, do you feel that the private sector is starting to embrace your involvement more, and why?
Yeah, we do. And first of all, let me say I'm happy to be here and happy to have the opportunity to talk to you guys about some of the issues that we face every day. No, we do see a change in the environment. I think for a lot of companies, they're beginning to understand that they're not the Lone Ranger when they have an incident. That 5 or 6, maybe 10 years ago, if there was some sort of breach at your company, you probably thought you were the only company that were dealing with issues like that. And questions about confidence with investors or customers were out there. I think it's pretty apparent now that we're all fighting this together, and the only way that we're going to be able to win this battle against these hackers, whether they be inside your own company or outside your company, is to work together and share the information. One of the things the FBI can bring to the table, we are looked at through the intelligence community as kind of the central repository of law enforcement for the United States. We work closely with other federal partners, Secret Service and others, but the expertise that we've brought into our headquarters that we have now deployed into our field offices is pretty spectacular. Guys that have given up a lot to come to work for the Bureau. And they can bring a lot of expertise to the table. Both to try to track down and locate and hopefully punish the bad guys, but also in an advisory role. And I would encourage you, hopefully you'll hear this throughout this next hour, is that you can call us and have a conversation without thinking that, okay, as soon as we identify that maybe we were a victim of something, that we're going to come rolling in with raid jackets and go to the media and let the cat out of the bag, shall we say, and we're not going to do that. And it's to our advantage not to do that. It's to your advantage for that not to happen. But bringing us in early, we can maybe set the stage for investigative efforts and also give you some insight of similar cases that we've seen that other companies are dealing with some of the same issues that you are.
Typically, are you being brought into these companies, or are you reaching out to them and proactively alerting them to issues that they may not even be aware of?
Sure, yeah, it depends on the type of incident. If it is a a breach of PII or PHI that either an individual within your company has orchestrated or some criminal organization from Eurasia, that's usually identified by the victim. If it is, and we're seeing this more often than not, an intrusion from a state sponsor of intrusions where they're trying to steal information about your company or trying to steal information about this government, 98% of the time we identify those intrusions and go out to the companies and make that referral.
We're often asked which agency should be involved given circumstances. Should this be the FBI or the Secret Service? We've had the opportunity to work with, on many occasions, both. Mm-hmm. And we get that question all the time. And as you sit here, can you explain the different roles that the FBI and the Secret Service play in this arena?
Sure, absolutely. And I think I'll caveat it, just like if somebody asks you which law firm they should reach out for, I'm sure you would have an answer.
Question.
I mean, I'm pretty confident in the FBI's ability, but from a broader context, there's kind of two separate arms that kind of govern the cyber world. Department of Homeland Security is, if you kind of look at a bank analogy, Department of Homeland Security is like the bank guard that stands at the bank. They try to provide information to companies, whether they're manufacturing or otherwise, so that company can protect themselves. But then once a breach occurs, once any kind of incident occurs, it rolls over to a law enforcement standpoint, and then that's typically us or the Secret Service. Secret Service, as many of you may know, was the investigating agency for the Target intrusion. So they handle primarily criminal intrusions, not exclusively, not about without us. I mean, they were part of our task force up there. We also do that, but one area that they don't get involved with at all is the national security type investigations, where you have China, for instance, hacking in and trying to use your company as a hop point to an actual victim, or they're trying to steal your information from your company itself. They're not equipped for that. That's not what their policy is.
And I think it's important to note for everyone that if you do get law enforcement involved, all of the state statutes that we deal with when we're talking about breach notification, they do have provisions in there that will allow you to delay notification based on a law enforcement investigation. But I can tell you that the various states' attorneys general are becoming very particular and picky with respect to delaying that notification, and really are insisting that be in writing and have certain language. And if you find yourself in that position where you are going to delay based on law enforcement investigation, you're going to want to make certain that you get that in writing from the law enforcement agency, and that you provide that to the various state attorney generals that are in fact going to be notified. Because if you don't do that, some of them will consider that a breach of the statute. And obviously you don't want to be inadvertently violating the statute when you have a pass, if you will, to delay in notification. So please keep that in mind. Let's take a step back for a minute. We're jumping the gun a little before there's a breach, and talk about what companies can do to reduce the risk of a breach or reduce exposure if they have a breach. I think everybody would agree that you can't prevent a data breach. Any company that tells you that they can, they're just mistaken. They're going to happen. Our job is to reduce the likelihood or reduce the exposure when it does happen. Dom, can you just address some of the proactive steps that companies can take in order to reduce the likelihood of a breach or reduce exposure if there is a breach?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Well, we always say it's not if, but it's when. And this stuff doesn't happen at Monday morning at 9 a.m. when everyone's at their desk, ready for a phone call to be picked up. I can't tell you, every holiday, every Thanksgiving, Jim and I crazy busy on Monday morning, Memorial Days, because that's when either a cyber attacker or just an intrusion or a theft in an office building, they know they have several days. So most important, you have to be prepared. Again, not if, but when. So have an incident response plan. Of all the policies today and all the proactive measures we're going to talk about, that's really the most critical. Have your team assembled. If you haven't already, you need to do that. And it's not just IT and legal. You have to think HR, communications, PR, legal, risk. And again, it's not just internal, but it's also your external. who are going to be your resources you're going to call when you do have an incident. The clock starts ticking as soon as, whether it's an employee or whoever, notifies you of the incident. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, these statutes and states are continuing to shrink and reduce the time deadline notification. Some of them are as short as 5 days from discovery of the incident. And so you're going to be in violation of these statutes if you don't have the team in place and you haven't run through the plan with the team. So Jim and I conduct all across the nation tabletop exercises with companies, and I would strongly recommend that you try and do that as well with your incident response plan. So run through a mock scenario. And again, maybe don't do it at Monday morning at 9 a.m. Call it over the weekend. Make sure the air conditioning's not on in the room. Try and make it, as realistic as possible. But the key thing, bring the team together so that everyone understands their roles. Because there's a lot of moving parts when an incident occurs. So incident response plan and running through that, I would think, is most critical when it comes to proactive steps.
And Dom, I'll let you continue with the additional points, but I do want to mention a couple things real quick. As Dom mentioned, when you're in the midst of a crisis, that's not the time to be negotiating these contracts. Okay, we deal typically in that mode with clients. They have not thought about the contracts ahead of time. You've got to engage mail houses. You have to engage call centers. You've got everyone running around like chickens with their heads cut off if they haven't prepared, and now they're going to try to negotiate the fine points of contracts. It doesn't work very well. So you do want to be proactive and take the time to know who are the vendors you're going to employ and review their contracts and be on the same page with them. And when we talk about preparation, I laugh because we go into many companies, and if you ask them about policies and emergency preparedness, they can tell you what they'll do if their CEO gets kidnapped. And I ask, well, how many times has someone been kidnapped? 0. If you ask them, how do they respond to a data breach, they look at you like you have 3 heads, and you say, well, how many data breach incidents have you had over the last couple of years? And they've had several, but they're still not on the same page. They still don't have a plan. And we can't emphasize how important it is. And we're going to talk about some of the statutory requirements and other things as to why you need to be planning ahead of time. But Tom, if you can continue beyond the incident
It's funny
response
too,
plan.
when we ask for the incident response plan, do you have one? No, we have one. It's our disaster recovery plan. And you read it, and it's all about if they have a flood or a fire. And I can tell you that the state attorneys general, when they're asking for your incident response plan, they're not looking for your flood plan and your fire plan. What are you going to do in the event of a data breach or data privacy incident? Outside of the incident response plan, another hot area, and we're seeing it's causing a lot of data breaches, is document retention. There are so many legacy records out there. And in fact, they don't get a lot of attention, but there are 28 of the states that have data destruction requirements, disposal statutes, that when you no longer have a legitimate business purpose to have personal information, you are to destroy it and not put it in the trash can. You are to shred it. You are to burn it. There's all these requirements under these state statutes for the disposal. But as a result, these things are laying around, whether it's in computers that are no longer being used and they're stuck in a closet, or an internal system of your former employees is online still. As a result, they are triggering a data breach. And what happens is you have to give notice to everybody, and they're calling you, I haven't worked for your company in 35 years. Why do you still have my data? And it's a difficult position. And all of a sudden, we see single plaintiff and class action lawsuits. And so you really can reduce some of the risk with document retention. Encryption. We always hear, we encrypt all of our laptops. That's great if you are doing that. Couple of things. Don't put the sticky note in the bag with the laptop that has the encryption key on it. We get that all the time. A couple of the states have actually started putting that in their statute. You can't have the key with the laptop. It's no longer encrypted. Or if you run through the encryption, we had an incident at Starbucks one time. Employee was on their computer, went up to get a coffee, came back, computer's gone. Client says, well, it's encrypted. Well, let's talk about it a little bit. No, it wasn't encrypted anymore, because when they typed in the key and then they went to go get their coffee, they've passed the encryption. So although encryption is a safe harbor under a lot of these statutes, and you don't have to give notice, you have to kind of run through the process and make sure that you really do have a fully encrypted computer. Another thing, who has access to PII in your organization? I'm amazed so many times we say, okay, let's try, and we have an incident, trying to investigate, perhaps it's an employee issue, a rogue employee. So who had access to this database? So many times I hear that 30% of company employees have access to folks' social security number and personal information. You need to reduce that. Only a need-to-know basis. The entire employee base doesn't need to have access to everyone else's. And in some of the state statutes, that alone could trigger a breach. We'll talk a little later, but you don't need to have a bad guy. There's this notion that we got to have the hacker. A lot of it's just mistakes, IT glitches, mailing, faxing, emailing to the wrong recipient. Again, there's no intent to do harm there, but under these state statutes, if you send PII, personal information, to someone who is not authorized to have that, that triggers a breach. So you don't need the bad guy coming in all the time and intruding and having that bad intent. And last thing is training. We'll talk a little later about all the AG investigations and OCR investigations, but their number one item that they are asking about after a breach is training. What are you doing to train your employees on how to safeguard data, how to protect personal information? And a lot of it is just basics. There's negligence. There's just the human element. So at the end of the day, if you can reduce that by training folks, you're going to be able to reduce the risk of subsequent data breaches, at least, or the less data breaches.
Jim, if I could jump in just a little bit, absolutely agree with everything you said. Just to tag on, with it not just being an IT problem, I think there's no silver bullet that you could purchase that's going to monitor your network and prevent intrusions. As we were talking earlier, we kind of analyzed or made an analogy to your home defenses. I mean, you may have an alarm system, you certainly have locks on your doors and your windows, but you don't just stop there. You watch and you look and you continue to monitor, and you don't just rely on ADT to be your only security. You don't leave your house with your door open. You train your children to shut the door and lock the door when they leave. You have to do the same thing with your employees to make sure that they understand the policies, and those policies are strictly enforced. On the intrusions from foreign government side of the threat, the vast majority of those intrusions occur from an employee opening an unsolicited email. And so the easy thing to do, and it's a hard thing to complete, but the easy thing to do is to target your employees and with training, as you suggested, to explain to them what the threat is and that how opening these emails about the All-Star game that they didn't ask for could have links in there that could compromise the network. And then if they do that, what do? Do they just ignore it, or do they immediately call IT and say, hey, I've got a problem? And then you test the employees. If you do training, you go to college, go to law school, there's always testing to see if that training is being effective. So you have to have somebody in the IT staff that's constantly running scenarios where they're sending out those kind of unsolicited emails to your employees to see what the response rate is. And then that it identifies your problem offenders, number one. It shows you whether your training is effective or not. Throughout most of the cases that we have, a more aggressive approach, and I don't mean aggressive in a negative sense, but a more aggressive approach as far as sort of training and policy implementation to your internal employees would have solved a lot of the problems that ultimately result in millions of dollars of expense to the company.
And you hit it on the point. Oftentimes, we'll deal with the incident response team themselves, and they all know the process. They know the plan if something were to happen. But does the rest of your employee base, where probably the incident's going to occur, do they know who to call? Especially if it's over the weekend or it's over, New Year. Do they know who to call off hours? And so that's critical, and that's part of the training that you can implement.
And one more thing on the access. You were talking about network access to files and what have you, and there's a component of physical access too. How many companies limit the physical access to the accounting department, to where employees cannot just walk through that area? As I've gone out and done presentations, it's not very many that do that. You can go on and Google right now a keylogger that it looks about like a thumb drive that you can put in line with somebody in the accounting department's keyboard and capture every one of their keystrokes, and it costs $19. And so I can do that. If I have access to your accounting department, I have access to that keyboard after hours. And then I have access to the online banking credentials that that individual uses when they do their transactions. It's a simple thing. It's $19. And don't think that you've got employees that aren't going to do that. We all have employees. The FBI has Hanson. We all have employees that, for whatever reason, life changes their situation. They were great employees, probably background investigated when they first came on, but companies typically don't do continuing background investigations. Life changes. I've got 3 kids. I know. I'm in a significantly different situation now than I was, 10 years ago. And so, when an employee feels like they have no other choice than to borrow money from the company that they intend to pay back, and they typically usually do intend to pay it back, sometimes that's the only recourse they have, is to get that keylogger and do things like that.
And we can't emphasize enough when it comes to employee and visitor restrictions. Too often companies are very lax at who accesses information. And to your point, hard copy information is just as important as computerized information. It's a lot easier. You can steal a lot more information much quicker if it's electronic, but we handle a number of data breaches every month that deal with hard copies of information. They contain the same data. It's just a little more difficult to get the information out. It's a little bulkier, but it contains the same data, and you can do the same harm with that information. One thing I do want to mention is we talk about these various state statutory requirements. It's important for everyone to keep in mind, because we get this question very frequently. It doesn't matter where your business is located. If you have one location in Ohio, it doesn't matter, because what the law looks to is the residency of the affected individuals. So if you gather information on employees or customers across the country, you have to comply with every state statute where those folks reside. So just because your business is based here or in another state doesn't mean you're not complying potentially with every state statute across the country, and potentially foreign statutes as well. So it's very important to keep that in mind, because too often companies get very parochial or tunnel vision, and they're only looking at their particular state's law, and it's a mistake. So we want to continually remind folks that they need to be thinking broader if they have data on individuals that reside outside of their home state. And one other point, we talk about timing and reporting and why education is so important. Timing is critical when you have an event like this. So your employees do have to know off hours, weekend, holiday. What do they do if they suspect an issue? If they suspect an issue, they should be picking up the phone and calling somebody that knows what to do. Because if you wait another 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 days, the clock is running. And unfortunately, people are going to be able to misuse that information for those additional days. And you're also, as Dominic mentioned, some of these statutes have very short timelines in which to comply. And as we'll talk later, if you don't comply, the fines and penalties are very substantial. I don't mean $10,000 or $20,000. I mean hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars. The regulators are taking this very seriously. So you do need to be paying attention to this. And one of the things that, quite frankly, has helped us in educating our clients and others across the country is Target, without question. I would say that pre-Target, most companies had a much different attitude when it came to being proactive and preparing for one of these events and actually looking at the internal workings of their organization as to what their risks were. Post-Target, now, when we go out and give presentations, people actually want us to come out and give these presentations, and they want to talk about what can they do to be proactive, because Target was unfortunately a very clear example of the type of risk and exposure. And it's not just for the Targets of the world, the big Sonys, the huge companies. This risk is being pushed down to the middle market and to smaller companies, and they are being targeted. So we want to make sure that companies of all sizes and shapes and industries are paying attention to this. One of the things that we're seeing the states do now is post-Target addressing this proactive issue and preparedness issue. Dom, can you talk just a little bit about some of the state statutes that are now requiring companies by law to be more proactive in their approach to protecting data?
Sure. Massachusetts came out a couple of years ago and really was the first state to come out and really have a detailed requirement for proactive policies. One of them is their written information security program. It sounds daunting. It's a 7-8 page document that really summarizes sort of the protections, the safeguards, technical, administrative safeguards you have in place to deal with personal information. I can tell you, if you have just one record of a Massachusetts resident and you have to give them notice, you also have to give notice to the Massachusetts Attorney General. Within 5 days, you're going to get a letter back from the Massachusetts Attorney General that says, please provide us with your written information security program. And they're not looking for any other policy that you have. They're looking for their detailed written information security program. One of their other proactive pieces is to require by contract any of your vendors that you deal with that you may pass on personal information to, or who may have access to personal information of a Massachusetts resident in this case. By contract, you have to contract with the vendor and they have to agree that they too are complying with the Massachusetts proactive policy requirement. And we're seeing this with OCR and Health and Human Services as well now, with business associates having to comply with HIPAA high-tech. Florida was the latest one, came out just a couple of weeks ago, went into effect July 1st. They didn't go into much detail as to what they require. They're vague, probably purposely, but they say that you are to employ proactive measures to protect personal information. So now, not only can they hit you on the back end when you do have the breach, they hit you on the front end for saying, well, you didn't have the proactive policies in place. So those are the two recent states that are really moving towards proactive requirement, and I think that's going to be a trend we're going to see. More and more states write in their statute requiring proactive measures.
Special Agent Morgan, what are you seeing on the federal front with respect to federal statutes or regulators getting involved and requiring companies to start paying attention more on the front end?
Sure. Yeah. We're not as involved on the civil side, obviously, being law enforcement. But we certainly believe that there's a push towards mandatory reporting of breaches, much like the financial institutions are required under certain circumstances to report suspicious activity or suspicious currency transactions, what have you. That's definitely an issue that is being voiced from law enforcement in general, specifically from the FBI, to our representatives that speak to the administration, that it's something that's needed, both to influence companies and to encourage them to report, but also to give them protection, to feel like that we can report this without any blowback on us. And so I agree 100% with what Dom said. I mean, it's the movement is certainly towards more mandatory reporting requirements and not less.
And we've seen as well with the SEC, they're going after entities for unfair and deceptive trade practices. And one of the things that's been most commonly cited is the privacy policies. So for many of you, if you look on your website, you're going to have a privacy policy that pops up. And what's happening is companies are not following their own privacy policy. And the SEC is coming in and fining companies saying, well, you've got a policy that you purport to follow, but you're not. So because you're not, you're unfortunately convincing people that they're safer than they are. It's an unfair and deceptive trade practice, and the SEC is fining companies. So every organization, really every regulator, is jumping on the bandwagon and getting involved in this area. So the landscape it's a minefield.
Yeah, and we deal with a lot of attorneys general on a daily basis. In fact, I'm moderating a panel in September in New York with about 12 different state attorneys general. But having talked to one of them just last week, and in line with what you were saying about the banking industry requiring just notice of suspicion, suspected incidents, these attorneys general are moving towards that trend. They want to be notified now, even if just say for instance you have malware on your system, it's a CryptoLocker version. They want to be notified that, hey, we're doing an investigation, but there's a potential that this is going to result into a data breach, and we may have to give notice to your residents, but we're just giving you the heads up. Some of these state attorneys general now want that sort of heads up just on suspicion, which really could change the landscape here if you start having to notify on every suspected incident.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you.
Oh, no.
And for good reason. I mean, this is not, I think, I'm a limited government kind of guy, but this is not an overreaching of the government. I think this is the only way that we can combat this problem, is to share the information about the breaches that you're seeing, the tactics that the bad guys are using, and use that information together. Look at your AV software. That's exactly what they do. They take intrusion attempts and malware submissions from their customers and put it together and send it out to everybody else, so that everybody is edified by the actions of the bad guys. Unless we take that approach to securing our networks, we're never going to be secure.
Dom, you had mentioned the recent statutory change down in Florida. That statute went into effect July 1. What other significant changes did they make in Florida, and how do you see that trending across the country?
Yeah, Florida really made some sweeping changes, again, effective July 1st. And again, if you have just an individual from Florida and you have one record, you have to comply with this statute. But as far as breach notification, they've now shrunk the timing. Florida always required notice within 45 days. Again, a trend we're seeing, Florida has shrunk that to 30 days. And that's from the date of discovery. So the first day the employee tells you that they lost their laptop or it was stolen out of their car, that's day number one. You have time to work with law enforcement. You have time to do a computer forensic investigation if you find the laptop, but that's day number one, and you get only 30 days now in Florida. Another trend we're seeing, and Florida has done this probably the vast change of all the states, expanding the definition of personal information. So before it was your typical name, social security number, credit card, debit card number. Florida's now added passport, not as big of a deal. They've added username and email in combination with password or your security question. All the questions that basically I can go on your Facebook account and answer all those questions, right? Where'd you get married? Where'd you go to high school? Who was your mascot in high school? All those questions now that I can find out. If you have a breach of that information, that triggers the Florida breach notification law. Again, so all these things you have to update. So to the extent you have an incident response plan and you've sort of detailed out, here's what we need. If you have this information that's been compromised, we may have to invoke the incident response plan. That all needs to go back and be tweaked. And these regulators, if they're asking for your plans, they want to make sure that they're updated and that they really reflect these latest changes. The largest change in the expansion definition, they have added medical information into their definition of personal information. So a company that has never had to comply with HIPAA, high-tech, they're not a covered entity. If you have workers' comp information, medical reimbursement information, a compromised loss of that will trigger their breach notification statute. And if you're a covered entity and you already have to deal with the breach notification laws under HIPAA and high-tech, you run through the new four-factor analysis under the final rule. Say, for instance, because there's an exception under most state statutes, if you comply with the federal notification law in your industry, such as HIPAA, you don't have to comply with the state. So say, for instance, you run through HIPAA as a covered entity and you don't have to notify under HIPAA. Florida now says, well, hey, you're not out. You have to now go under the Florida statute and see if you'd have a notification obligation. And oftentimes, you could be in the case where you don't have a HIPAA, you don't have a federal breach requirement notice, but you may have the state now. And even if you do give notice under HIPAA, Florida attorneys general want to know. Florida has now added an affirmative requirement that if you have 500 or more records, the attorney general wants to know. They want to be notified within that same time period that you give notice to their residents. And they took it one step further. I've never seen this in any other 47 of the breach statutes. Florida now says the Attorney General has the right to ask for your forensic report upon notification of the breach, and they have the right to ask for your policies, such as your incident response plan. So I haven't seen it just because it just came out, so we haven't really seen it in action yet. But I can imagine that they're going to be sending out a letter right after a notification that says, please provide us with any forensic reporting and please provide us with your incident response policies in regards to a breach.
And by the way, if I can interrupt for a minute, Dom, when you engage a forensic company to come in and take a look at your system and try to determine A, has the problem been fixed, and B, what all happened, we always tell our clients, do not engage that forensic company directly. Let counsel engage that forensic company so that you can argue its privilege. Because in too many circumstances, we've had clients, when they've had a forensic exam done, the forensics examiner may find things well beyond what we're talking about. And that can create a whole nother level of issues that they didn't really want to or weren't prepared to deal with. So you want to make sure that council is engaging those vendors to protect them on a privileged basis.
In terms of vendor, this is unique, never seen this either. Florida's requirement, if you are a vendor, so you're not the owner of the information, but you happen to receive the personal information as a result of being an IT or staffing, document retention company, and you receive personal information, and you happen to have the breach. In fact, almost a third of all breaches are a result of the vendor having the breach. In Florida, now that vendor is required within 10 days to give notice to the owner of the information. So that would be the company who originally got the personal information, who's considered the owner. So there's now a requirement if you're a vendor to give notice.
But best practices, we all deal with vendors every day, all of our companies. Your vendor agreement should have a requirement in there that if the vendor discovers or suspects any type of breach that affects the information you provided them, they should have a contractual obligation to notify you within 48 hours. Because too often what happens is the vendor sits on it, nothing happens for 60 days, you've blown through all the statutory requirements, and the regulators aren't going to go after the vendor, they're going to come after you. So you need to make sure contractually that all of your vendor agreements have been updated and you have those types of requirements.
Yeah, they're seeing them as an agent of yours. And as a result, the clock starts when the vendor realizes that they discovered and have the breach. So the 30-day timing, like for instance here in Florida, it's when the vendor discovers the breach. So if they wait the full 10 days and actually comply with the statute, you now only have 20 days. So we shrunk that 30 down to 20. And one other thing, they write in their statute now, the AG can bring an unfair and deceptive trade practice for violation of this statute. $10,000 per violation. That could mean per record compromised. So we've seen these regulators really use that word per violation. They've used that as each individual that is affected. So 10,000 multiplied by lots of individuals.
Special Agent Morgan, as we're talking about this expansion of the definition of personally identifiable information to include healthcare, I'm curious, do you have any opinion on why the states are now starting to include health information in these statutes and broadening that protection, if you will?
Sure. Yeah, I don't think the storage of health information online is anything new. Hospitals have been trying to move towards that for years, but certainly with Obamacare and those initiatives, the media reports of that have increased, especially as you have individuals talking about how vulnerable the databases are. That doesn't do anything but tantalize the hackers to try to steal that information. So I think that's one part of it. But if you think about what PHI does, it gives you a full picture of an individual. I mean, a social security number, bank account number, I have a limited amount. It's quite a bit, but still it's a limited picture of an individual. But if I have all of your health records, I know where your scars are. I know where your surgeries are. I know everything about you. I can completely assume your identity through plastic surgery or whatever I would need to do. And so the chance of that information getting into the hands of, let's say, a terrorist and being able to use that to cross borders without being detected is so much more valuable than just PII alone. In fact, it's my understanding that on the black market, PII is like $1 a record, but PHI is $30 a record. So even the bad guys value that significantly more than simply a bank account number.
Jim, two more changes. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you. Kentucky yesterday became the 47th state, so now we're left with Alabama, New Mexico, and South Dakota, who have not jumped on the breach notification bandwagon, but they will, I'm sure. If not by this year, then definitely next year. So no big changes with Kentucky. They just became the 47th. Iowa also a couple of days ago amended their statute. And this is what we see. We're always seeing amendments to their breach notification statute. Iowa picked up on a huge issue, and that is a lot of these state statutes who originally borrowed from California. They were the first one that came out many years ago. And everyone kind of borrowed the language. Well, there's a misnotion as to whether paper records, Jim had touched on this, but whether a breach of paper records containing personal information does trigger the breach notification laws. And Iowa makes it clear that they don't care what medium the personal information is in, and they actually say paper, electronic, or otherwise, we want to be given notice. And they also added a notification that their Attorney General also to be notified. So again, another trend, AG enforcement, AG involvement is really the trend here with all these state statutes.
Well, as we, let's keep on the same trend. As we talk about trends, Special Agent Morgan, what are you seeing trend-wise, increase, decrease in these types of data privacy incidents, and are you seeing it in specific industries, specific size companies? Kind of, how do you see things playing out, and especially looking forward?
No, certainly it's not going to go away. There's no evidence that there's a decrease in the threat of data compromises or computer intrusions. I think as the larger companies become more aware and more afraid after the Target incident and others, and start hardening themselves as targets, it just opens up to smaller companies the potential that they are now the easier target for the bad guys. And so I think that's going to be a concern for small companies that A, don't have the expertise, and B, don't have the money to invest in some of the protections that they need to do. I think there's also going to be a move to targeting the user more, and it gets back to what we talked about before. Looking at inside, testing and training your employees. If you have really hard and sufficient firewalls in place and IT security apparatus in place to deal with some of these issues, the vulnerable, weakest link in your security apparatus is going to be your end user. And that's going to be the individual that is, as you mentioned before, putting information out on Facebook about themselves. And so the unsolicited emails are going to become more and more appearing to be solicited. It's going to be if I have information out there about coaching my son's baseball team, it's going to be an email related to that because some hacker did some kind of information dive and found me on the Facebook and is using that information against me in an email so that I'll click on that and then again thwart all your efforts at securing your network. And so your weak link is going to come back to being your individual employees, and I think the bad guys know that. They've always for years have been people that have been very enterprising and could make a lot of money in private industry. But they know the key is to go after the weak target.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of funny when I asked you earlier what industries were most vulnerable or susceptible, and your response was those that are connected to the internet and those that have employees.
Right.
So I think it's a fair statement that would include any and all industries.
Sure. Absolutely.
You made the comment about the weak link really being the employees, and we had gotten a question emailed. What was our point of view about staff bringing smartphones to work and the possibility of them taking pictures of sensitive data, that defeating the rest of the controls they may have in place? And that's something that we struggle with our clients every day. They bring your own device to work because that is probably, without question, the weakest link. And we're finding employees, unfortunately, have so much information on this little device that they carry around and that their kids play with and that they lose and that they don't tell you about, and they just replace it. And all that information is loaded on their smartphone, and that is a real issue. And we work with clients regularly and counsel them on what they can do to try to limit that. The company, if the employee quits the company and they're upset, they have all of your information, whether they sell it, misuse it, give it to a competitor, and there's a lot that are in these phones now that can be misused.
And that's where it goes back to the training. We've seen, especially on the counterintelligence side, the stealing of trade secrets from companies. We see that there is a change in morality of employees today, especially the younger employees that have grown up hacking their phones and hacking PlayStations and making their devices do things that they weren't originally designed to do. The kids of today, for lack of a better word, and I can't believe I'm saying that now, have a different mindset about right and wrong. If it's on the internet, it's fair game. And that's another aspect of training that I think that companies need to address. And the Bureau under Director Louis Free several years ago, he instituted a whole ethics training for all the special agents to not only, he tries to hire good people, but also to train them about being ethical and why it's important to be ethical. And I think that kind of training is also important for companies to try to change the mentality of some of the, especially the guys that are the geeks, the ones that are the most capable of doing some of the things that we're talking about.
And you mentioned misappropriation of trade secrets, and we have a large trade secret practice, and oftentimes we will see the two worlds collide. So we have an employee that sticks the USB drive into their computer the day before they leave, and they intend to take contracts, maybe their contacts, some pricing, trade secret material. But in the interim, they also take personal information. And that all gets downloaded on a USB drive. You realize that after they leave, well, now all of a sudden you have a two-front attack. You're in court on a temporary restraining order trying to get the trade secrets back, but at the same time, you probably have breach notification obligations. So we often see they may, again, only intend to steal, not that it's appropriate, but they only intend to steal the confidential trade secrets, but at the same time, they're stealing personal information.
We've got a couple of other questions here, and a couple of the same questions, and it's interesting, questioning whether the statutes that we're talking about and all these obligations, does it matter the size of your organization? In other words, is there a small business exception to this? Unfortunately, the answer is definitively no. And specifically, I can tell you that the Massachusetts statute addresses this in part, and what they talk about when it comes to technology and the required encryption, it's not whether or not it's economically feasible, it's whether it's technologically feasible. So they don't care whether or not you can afford it, doesn't matter. The law requires you to encrypt under the Massachusetts statute. All of the statutes that we're talking about do not have any type of exemption that would allow you to avoid your obligations as a result of being a smaller business. The other question that we had gotten was, has anyone yet quantified the damages caused by the Target breach? And the answer is no. But we can tell you that currently the average cost of card replacement as a result of the Target breach was $5.10 per card. There were over 100 million people affected. So to give you an idea of the cost, the damages related to Target are going to be in the billion, with a B, $billion range, not $1 million range. And unfortunately, they were hundreds of millions of dollars short on their insurance coverage to cover this type of incident. Even though they had a couple $100 million in coverage, it's not even going to touch what we're talking about. And not only are they dealing, obviously, with the costs related to card replacement, they are obviously lost business. They are also dealing with many, many class action lawsuits, including shareholder derivative suits against the board of directors. And if anybody ever wants to read it, I'll be happy to send it to you. It makes for a very interesting read, the allegations that were made in the complaint about how the breach was being handled and why, allegedly, there was a delay in notifying the public. Obviously, it was in the midst of shopping season where retailers make the bulk of their money. And those are the types of allegations that are being made in that complaint. But it does make for a very interesting read. As we go back and we're talking about the issues, hacking and breaches, to you, Special Agent Morgan, are we seeing this as a greater internal threat, external threat? Where is the biggest threat to the companies?
It's so hard to quantify. I mean, I think by and large the threat is outside of your company. I mean, that's where the threat is. But the best approach to dealing with the problem is internally. I mean, there certainly is an internal threat. An HR issue, we're dealing with problem employees and what have you. But again, addressing the following of the policies and procedures that you've set up and enforcing those policies and procedures is certainly an internal issue. And if you do that, you're going to be greatly along the way to securing yourself, as opposed to just buying a silver bullet application that you think is going to take care of your network.
And I can tell you that 90% of the breaches that we deal with and have dealt with over the years are not the foreign hacker coming into the organization. It's either a rogue employee or, more likely, just a careless employee. Or there may be no negligence or careless activity involved. We've dealt with many instances where somebody's mailing a large package full of documents that happen to contain PII or PHI, and it's lost in the mail. Well, you now have an obligation to report and provide notification to those individuals. Unfortunately, many companies, they don't even realize what their obligations are when it comes to this type of reporting. So education, obviously, from our perspective, is very important, but we do want to make sure that they're paying attention internally to what they're doing relative to training to try to reduce those acts of carelessness.
Sure, but I would be remiss if I didn't state just once again that the threat from the intrusions from foreign governments is enormous, especially China. I mean, I'm not breaking news here. It's been all over the media. I mean, it is so pervasive that if you are connected to the internet, chances are that you are either a victim or going to be a victim of an intrusion. They may not be after your information, but they will use you as a hot point to go somewhere else. And so, and the scary part about that is those are the threats and the intrusions that you don't know about typically. I mean, these guys, it's called the advanced persistent threat. These guys are very, very good at what they do. And unless you have pretty sophisticated monitoring going on with a very sophisticated and trained IT staff, you're probably not going to notice the fact that they're in there. And so, even with that threat, focusing on the internal employees is paramount. But it is a huge threat that we can't even address in the FBI. I mean, it's a State Department issue, it's a administration issue, it's a law enforcement issue. It's a very complicated problem to try to get a foreign government to stop, intruding upon, our companies. So it's out there.
And I assume, and I know this, but one of the ways that the private sector can assist you in your efforts is by actually reporting these incidents to you so that you can put the pieces together, because they may only see the one little piece that affects their company, not realizing that it's part of a bigger enterprise.
Sure, and the FBI is spending a lot of resources, manpower, and money in trying to come up with ways of facilitating that reporting. iGuardian is one way that we've developed, where it's a reporting portal where your information would go directly to the FBI and available to all the intelligence community. And the theory behind it is that if multiple companies in a particular sector started seeing the same type of intrusions, we would be able to respond quickly and maybe send out advisories to that sector and say, look, you want to address this security hole in your applications, or whatever the case may be. And so look for iGuardian there. It's beginning to roll out now. It's not as pervasive as we would like, but it is something that we're trying to encourage and promote.
Excellent. Don, we don't have a lot of time left, but I think it's important that we at least address what a company should do if they suspect that they may be a victim of some type of data security incident.
Sure. And in the aftermath of Target, we're seeing a lot of clients wanting to get notice out the same day or the next day. And we always have to, I know it's hard to breathe in these situations, but you have to stop and breathe a little bit. And if you can't answer what happened, how did it happen, what are you going to do for me, and what are you doing to prevent this, you can't notify anybody, because it's just going to cause a lot more questions and a lot more angry individuals. And so Target sort of seeing that as a result of all these class actions. But this is the time to break the glass and grab that incident response plan that we talked about a little bit before. But the most critical, in the interest of time, in making sure you have the right people. We talked about that, internal and external, and when to call them, when to bring in experienced breach coaches, when to bring in law enforcement, forensics. And once you go through all of that and realize you do have a notifiable incident, you do have a breach, figuring out who needs to be notified and when. You can get the picture with all of these state statutes that we've been talking about, and multiply about all the other ones that are out there. They all have different timing requirements, all have different content requirements. Who needs to be notified, how, when, in what form. And so you need to be making sure that you're working with experienced breach counsel to take you through that process and figuring out who else needs to be notified. State attorney generals, federal agencies. If you're in PCI world, they need to be notified for credit card breaches. The media, internal, external stakeholders, board, officers. And then again, offering a remedy. What are you going to do for these folks? Is it credit monitoring? Well, not always. Target unfortunately, told the world that everyone can sign up for free credit monitoring. Well, it was just a credit card breach. Credit monitoring is really not going to do anything for you for a credit card breach. But now everyone's sort of in that mindset that data breach, oh, I get free credit monitoring. So it'll be interesting where we'll go from the remedy standpoint. But keep in mind, from day number one, from discovery of the incident, you have to remember the high likelihood of either class action lawsuit, single plaintiff litigation, and or regulatory investigation. So from day one, make sure there's not emails going around, oh my, we had a breach, it was HR's fault, no, it was IT's fault, and you keep wording, breach. Well, guess what, your clock started, and guess what Exhibit A is going to be to the complaint and the first document request and discovery. So keep that in mind. This stuff's going to go public, and you just want to make sure those emails are not attached to pleadings and attached to regulatory consent agreements.
And I want to mention one thing. Dominic was talking about Target and them offering credit monitoring, and back to the question of the cost of what will be the ultimate price that Target pays. It was very interesting when they decided to provide credit monitoring to the world. One of the things they did was they emailed that out to everyone that they had an email address for. Unfortunately, the hackers took that email and they duplicated it. And so prior to that email going out, the only thing a hacker, the bad folks would have had was your credit card or your debit card and PIN. When you clicked on that site to register for credit monitoring, you gave them your name, your address, and your social security number. So now we have no idea what the true damage is going to be, but that breach inside of the breach will be a very significant piece of the ultimate damages here, because now folks that would never have been exposed to any harm beyond having to change and swap out a credit card and having to call and get some bogus charges taken off their bill now have to worry about they themselves provided their SOC to these folks that were involved. So handling these incidents in the way that you go about communicating is critical. You have to think about how you get the message out and how do you do it in a way that doesn't create a bigger problem.
Yeah. And rarely do we suggest emailing anything regarding the breach, as Jim had just pointed out. I mean, to the extent, obviously Target had a lot of people, but there were ways around that. But to the extent you're a smaller incident, U.S. mail, send it in the mail. Things won't get posted to Facebook so easily, won't land on the internet and have another breach. So we try to eliminate the use of emails for communication.
I want to make sure quickly, we had a couple of other questions. One that dealt with specific services that can be provided to businesses concerning trade secret protection. And on our side of the house, we come in and do a lot of reviews with our clients on how do they protect their assets, including trade secrets, other information that you have. How do you protect that? There's a lot that you can do that from the business side to protect that information. The question was to both of us, and what was, how can the FBI provide help in protecting clients' trade secret information?
Well, certainly we can talk about the way that you have your trade secrets protected, where they are on the network, and possibly give some advice there. But also where your company employees, especially your C-level employees, are traveling and what devices they're taking with them when they travel. I've got a great video of an employee that goes to a foreign country and leaves his webcam on, and it records. And as the cleaning crew comes in to service his room, also other individuals come in to service his data. And it's pretty incredible. And so you have to assume that's happening. So when you travel, you certainly want to take clean devices and limit as you would not talk about breaches in email, you may want to limit the communications that you're talking about. So, reach out for your local FBI. We can put you in touch with the right people that can give you some insight in those areas as well.
I know we're getting to the end of our time. I do want to ask both Special Agent Morgan and Dominic to just provide their thoughts on where we're headed. If we're back here in 1 year talking about this topic, what do they think, looking into the crystal ball, we're going to be talking about?
More than legislation, unfortunately. I think we're going to see more states trending to, decreasing the amount of time, expanding the definition, and requiring proactive measures. I think we're going to see a lot of amendments to the laws. There continues to be, an effort to create one federal breach notification law. Many efforts have failed I think they'll continue to fail. But ultimately, if we do have one, it's going to be so onerous, everyone's going to want to go back to the 47 different state statutes. So I think more legislation, more requirements, proactive for training, and I think we're going to see more class actions. I think judges are going to not be dismissing these cases past summary judgment as much. So.
And from my perspective, it's again, the targeting of the weakest link, which is going to be your users. Sometimes, when I say users, I don't necessarily mean, the low-level employees of the company either. I mean your C-level executives as well. Targeting of those employees, utilizing the information that they put on Facebook and other publicly accessible avenues against those employees to get them to believe that emails that are sent to them are legitimate emails, and targeting of their devices. Personal devices overall, but certainly the devices of your executives are going to be continued to be at risk going forward.
Excellent. Well, I would like to thank Special Agent Morgan and Dominic for their insights today, and for those of you viewing the webcast, you can still email questions. We'll certainly get back to you. For those of you here in Cleveland, if you want to stick around and you have additional questions, we will all be here. We're happy to answer any questions that you have. Our team will continue to track news and developments regarding this area. As Dominic mentioned, it's very fluid. These statutes are changing daily. The courts are coming out with new opinions. It's very difficult to keep track, if you don't do it for a living, on what's happening and what you may be exposed to. We communicate this information through our online community, the Business Advocate, at businessadvocate.mcdonaldhopkins.com. It's on the front page of your handouts. If you registered for the event, you were automatically a temporary member of the community. You received an email containing your login, temporary password, and additional information. So you did get a legitimate email from us, if you're wondering. So no worries. So if you do sign up, you will be getting periodic updates and information from us. Or if you provide us your card, we're happy to provide you information. Tune into the Business Advocate for any follow-up Q&A, and this will be recorded. To the extent you want to provide it to anyone else in your organization, please do so. If you have any thoughts or perspectives or comments, we appreciate it. We're going to be emailing a survey requesting feedback. I know you get a lot of those, whether you're flying Delta or attending an event, but if you can take 30 seconds and give us some feedback, we would obviously appreciate it. It only helps improve our content and our programming. Thank you for attending.